In 204 BC, the Carthaginians began to prepare for the expected invasion of Africa by Scipio. Lookouts were placed along the entire coast to raise the alarm if the Romans made a landing. There was also the problem of the Numidian revolt. You will remember that both Massinissa and Syphax had revolted after meeting with Scipio, but the Carthaginians were determined to bring at least one of the chieftains back to their banner. So Hasdrubal Gisco visited King Syphax. He offered his daughter's hand in marriage, and Syphax accepted, and thus a new alliance was formed with Carthage. The Carthaginians believed that Syphax would be more determined to defend the capital, since his wife was a native Carthaginian. After the alliance was put in place, Hasdrubal Gisco spent most of his time with Syphax. He urged the king not to take his rival Massinissa lightly. Livy writes, quote, "Encouraged by these representations, Syphax commenced war with Massinissa, and in the very first battle defeated and routed his rival. Massinissa with a few horsemen escaped from the field and fled to a mountain range called by the natives Bellum. Several households with their tent wagons and cattle, their sole wealth, followed the king, but the bulk of the population submitted to Syphax." End quote. After this victory, Syphax captured even more of his rivals' towns and placed garrisons inside them. He was also determined to hunt down and either capture or kill Massinissa. He assigned this all-important task to one of his leading officers, Bonkar. Livy describes the pursuit. Quote, "Bonkar hastened in his pursuit of Massinissa, catching him in a narrow valley. He blocked both entrances and inflicted a severe loss on the enemy. Massinissa, with not more than 50 troopers, got away through steep mountain tracks, unknown to his pursuers. Bonkar, however, kept on his track and overtook him in the open country, where he surrounded him so completely that the whole party were killed, with the exception of 4 who, with Massinissa, himself wounded, slipped out of his hands during the fray. Their flight was observed, and the cavalry were sent in pursuit. They spread out over the plain, some making a short route to head off the 5 fugitives, whose flight brought them to a large river. Dreading the enemy more than the river, they spurred their horses without a moment's hesitation into the water, and the rapid current carried them downstream. 2 were drowned before their pursuers' eyes, and it was also believed that Massinissa had perished. He, however, with the 2 survivors, landed amongst the bush on the other side. This was the end of Bonkar's pursuit, as he would not venture into the river, and did not believe that there was anyone now left for him to follow. He returned to the king with the baseless story of Massinissa's death, and messengers were sent to carry the good news to Carthage. The report soon spread throughout Africa, and affected men's minds in very different ways. Massinissa was resting in a secret cave and treating his wound with herbs, and for some days kept himself alive on what his 2 troopers brought in from their forays. As soon as his wound was sufficiently healed to allow him to bear the movements of the horse, he started with extraordinary boldness on a fresh attempt to recover his kingdom. End quote. With Massinissa alive and well, Scipio decided to support his claim to the throne. This decision was made quite easy since Syphax had previously defected to Carthage. However, at the moment, the claim meant nothing, since Massinissa stood little chance of gaining any serious advantage against Syphax's army. Meanwhile, King Syphax decided to send envoys to Scipio, warning him against an invasion of Africa. Syphax made it quite clear that if the Roman general decided to press the issue against Carthage, he would have no other choice but to intervene against the Romans. Livy writes, quote, "Scipio recognized that he was deprived of the valuable support which he had hoped from Syphax in his African campaign, but he decided to send the envoys back at once, before their mission became generally known. He gave them a letter for Syphax in which he reminded him of the personal ties between them, and the alliance he had formed with Rome. The visit of the Numidians could not, however, be kept secret, for they strolled about the city and were seen at headquarters, and there was a danger of the real object of their visit becoming all the more widely known, and of the army being discouraged at the prospect of having to fight Syphax and the Carthaginians at the same time." End quote. Scipio decided he would launch the invasion of Africa as soon as possible before his army became demoralized about the news of Syphax's defection, and so he began to prepare the fleet for departure. 45 days of provisions were provided, along with 15 days of cooked meat. He also double-checked the water supplies, because he could not be sure of access to fresh water once he made a landing. He was assured by his quartermaster that the amount of water was such that there was enough to last for 45 days, which matched the duration of the food supplies. With the supplies brought on board and secured, Scipio gave the fleet captain instructions to sail for Cape Farina, which was 16 miles northeast of Utica. The voyage was expected to take 3 days, and so it would be Utica where Scipio would try to gain a foothold in Africa. And if that operation was successful, he could set his sights on the grand prize, Carthage itself. Livy writes, quote, "Then he ordered the trumpeter to sound the signal for departure, and as the winds freshened, they were quickly carried out of sight. In the afternoon, they were enveloped in so thick a fog that they had difficulty in keeping their ships from colliding with one another, and as they got out to sea, the wind dropped. During the night, a similar fog prevailed, which dispersed after sunrise, and at the same time the wind freshened. At last they caught sight of land, and a few minutes later the pilot informed Scipio that they were only 5 miles from the coast of Africa. If he would give orders for him to steer for it, the pilot assured him the whole fleet would soon be in port. When he caught sight of land, Scipio offered a prayer that this first view of Africa might bring luck to himself and to the Republic. He then gave orders for the fleet to set anchor." End quote. The alarm was raised in Carthage that the Romans, with an army of 35,000, had landed near Utica. The gates were closed, and additional sentinels were posted along the walls. Livy writes, quote, "The sight of a hostile fleet, followed by the bustle and excitement of the landing, created consternation and alarm, not only in the fields and farms on the coast, but in the cities as well. Not only were the roads filled everywhere by crowds of men and troops of women and children, but the peasantry were driving their livestock inland, so that you would say that Africa was suddenly being depopulated. They had never seen a Roman army other than those employed on raiding expeditions, who picked up what they could in the fields and always got back to their ships before the countrymen could assemble together to meet them." End quote. The next day, the Carthaginians dispatched 1,000 cavalry to scout the area around Utica. They harassed the Romans as they began to establish their camp. However, the Romans soon gained the edge in the skirmishes that followed, and the Carthaginian cavalry force was annihilated. Free for the moment, Scipio then pillaged the surrounding countryside in order to keep his army well supplied. He also supervised the unloading of all the supplies from his fleet and ensured it was done in a timely manner. Roman morale was greatly boosted when Massinissa finally arrived with 2,000 Numidian cavalry. The combined forces then laid siege to Utica. Scipio stationed his army on several hills about a mile distant from Utica. The Romans launched a direct assault against the city's walls, but the Carthaginian defenders were able to repulse it. Carthage now decided to raise a new cavalry force to replace the one that was lost. Hanno, a Carthaginian aristocrat, was placed in charge of this task force. Once the unit reached a strength of 4,000, Hanno decided to station his army at a town called Cilicia, which was located about 15 miles from the Roman camp. Scipio realized that such a force could not only disrupt his siege of Utica, but also his foraging efforts. He decided to set a trap. He would have Massinissa launch an attack on the town, and after the Carthaginians took the field, he would then start an orderly retreat. Then at the opportune moment, Scipio would arrive and surround the enemy. Livy describes the engagement. Quote, "Massinissa, in accordance with his instructions, rode right up to the gates, and when the enemy appeared, retired as though afraid to meet him. This simulated fear made the enemy all the more confident, until he was tempted into a rash pursuit. The Carthaginians had not yet all emerged from the city, and their general had more than enough to do in forcing some, who were heavy with wine and sleep, to seize their weapons and bridle their horses, and preventing others from rushing out of the gates in scattered disorder, with no attempt at formation and even without their standards. The first, who incautiously galloped out, fell into Massinissa's hands, but they soon poured out in a compact body, and in greater numbers, and the fighting became more equal. At last, when the whole of the Carthaginian cavalry were in the field, Massinissa could no longer bear the weight of their attack. His men did not, however, take to flight, but retired slowly before the enemy's charges, until their commander had brought them as far as the rising ground, which concealed the Roman cavalry. Then these latter charged from behind the hill, horses and men alike fresh, and threw themselves in front and flank and rear upon Hanno and his troops, who were tired out with the fight and the pursuit. Massinissa at the same time wheeled around and recommenced fighting. About 1,000 in the front ranks, unable to effect a retreat, were surrounded and killed. Amongst them, Hanno himself. The rest, appalled at their leader's death, fled and were pursued by the victors for more than 30 miles. As many as 2,000 were either killed or made prisoners." End quote. Fearing the city might fall, Carthage dispatched urgent messages to Hasdrubal Gisco and Syphax, imploring them to relieve the siege of Utica. Hasdrubal wasted no time, and according to Livy, assembled an army of 30,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Syphax soon joined him, bringing another 50,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The united armies then camped near Utica. With such a massive force nearby, Scipio broke off the siege of Utica and began preparations to build a more entrenched camp. He selected a place called Castra Cornelia. This spot was situated by the sea and also afforded excellent defenses by land. And so it was here that he set up his winter quarters. After the work was completed, the legions were placed inside the camp's defenses. Scipio then awaited further supplies from Sicily. Hasdrubal and Syphax also set up their own winter quarters. Back in Italy, things were becoming even more desperate for Hannibal. He had lost his best port in Locri, and therefore was unable to receive any adequate supplies. All he could do now is wait, and hope by some miracle the Carthaginian Senate would resupply him. In the meantime, he was forced to raise taxes and confiscate property. This made him unpopular with the local population in Bruttium, and defections began to increase. After the loss of Locri, Hannibal established his last base at Croton. He controlled only the immediate area around this city. He was effectively surrounded by multiple Roman armies that severely outnumbered him. And yet, despite every advantage, the Romans still refused to launch a decisive assault. The plan was to starve Hannibal into submission. With so few supplies in hand, Hannibal had to pick his engagements wisely. According to Livy, the Roman consul Tuditanus was marching near Croton when he literally ran into Hannibal out in the open. An irregular battle ensued, and the Romans were repulsed, losing 1,200. They retreated in confusion to their camp, but lacking supplies, Hannibal decided not to press the matter any further. The following night, Tuditanus left his camp under the cover of darkness. He ordered a nearby proconsul to bring up his legions. With his army nearly doubled in size, the consul returned to Croton, seeking out Hannibal again. Hannibal decided to accept battle in order to keep the road open for foraging. The Romans, however, were superior in numbers and quality. Thus, Hannibal was forced to retreat back to Croton with losses. At this point, Consul Tuditanus left Hannibal alone to focus on other areas in Bruttium. Several cities had already begun to defect away from Hannibal. This concludes the events for the year 204 BC.